Okay, hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this installment of the Invasive Species webinar series. My name is Emily Posturero, and I am a Program Development Coordinator here at the ISC, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the Invasive Species Center, their head office is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Batchewana, and Garden River First Nations, as well as the longtime settlement of the Métis people in the Robinson-Huron Treaty area. For those of you who aren't familiar with who we are a not-for-profit organization, and what we do is connect stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. I encourage all of you to check out our website where we have a lot of fantastic invasive species related resources, including past webinars, but also many species profiles and best management practices databases. So that is at invasivespeciescenter.ca, so please feel free to check that out. On our homepage of our website, you can also sign up all at once for our newsletter, bi-weekly media scan, and event invitations, which is how you would hear about our upcoming webinars. So you can sign up there. And I also just want to highlight that we have launched our invasive species training program with 2 online courses. That's for invasive forest pest training and oak wilt training. So again, on our website, you can sign up to receive updates on our training program, and you can also enroll in the courses themselves. I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items. So there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar. However, you can type out questions at any time. We just ask that you put any questions in the Q&A box. So there's the chat and the Q&A. Please put them in the Q&A box, and then I will read those questions myself aloud for a presenter to respond to at the end of her presentation. If you have any technical difficulties at any time, you can put those in the chat box, or if you prefer, email the email that was found in your registration. So that would be info@invasivespeciescenter.ca, and we will try to resolve it for you. We have enabled closed captioning for this webinar. So if you'd like to follow along that way, you can just turn on the closed caption button on your taskbar. And lastly, there will be a brief survey following the webinar. So if you could just take a moment to fill that out, we would really appreciate it. Now, today's webinar is titled Knock, Knock, Knocking on Non-Native Doors, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jesica Goldsmit. Jesica is interested in the distribution of species and in increasing knowledge related to aquatic invasive species by assessing their risk. She completed her studies in biology at the National University of Cordoba in Argentina and has a PhD in oceanography at the University of Quebec in Rimouski. She then continued research as a postdoc fellow at Fisheries and Oceans between the regions of Winnipeg and Montjoli from 2016 to 2022. And she's currently a biologist on risk assessment of aquatic invasive species, working for the government of Quebec at the Ministry of Forests, Wildlife, and Parks. Dr. Jesica Goldsmit, I'm very happy to introduce you. Welcome.
Thank you all. Well, this is just to start, I don't know, in another way, a webinar to pay a bet also, and just to put a little bit of a Halloween spirit. But don't worry, I will take it out so I can be more serious talking about the subject for which I has been invited. So I will share the screen. Here, and Emily, can you tell me if everything is looking good?
Looks good.
Okay, awesome. So yes, I will be presenting some of the works that I have done during my PhD and my postdoc. After during my postdocs, and then at the end the situation of Quebec and invasive species with my current position in the government of Quebec. But before starting, I just want to say that a lot of what I will be presenting has been done thanks to great collaborations, mainly from people from DFO, Fisheries and Oceans, and Dr. Kimberly Holland, DFO in Winnipeg, and then Chris McKinsey and DFO Montjali, Maurice Lamontagne Institute, and my supervisor of my PhD supervisor, Philippe Archambault at Laval University. And also now working in the Ministère des Forêts, Faune et Parcs. I'm pleased to be part of this amazing group that is led by Annick Drouin. So I just want to acknowledge all of the work that we have done together. So I will be talking about aquatic invasive species, marine and freshwater in the Arctic and Quebec, mainly related to fish and benthos and planktonic species in a climate change context, and how to assess the risk and how to predict the habitat suitability using species distribution models. During this presentation, we will focus more on the material that is already published on risk assessment, focused on species horizon scanning in the Canadian Arctic. And most of these results are from the collaborations from DFO. So let's start with this assessment area that is the Hudson Bay Complex and the Canadian Arctic and Arctic in general. And we know, I won't go into detail, but briefly, just for context, we know that climate change, particularly in the Arctic, with this increase in temperature, the effect is that the sea ice will decrease, just as one of the main changes. And with this scenario, like the shipping traffic that is known to occur in this area is predicted to increase, since there will be less ice. So more ships can transit through this region. We know that ships are one of the main vectors of aquatic invasive species. And these species can be transported either through shipping in ballast water tanks, which is the water that is held in tanks to provide stability, and or they can be attached as biofouling. So there are organisms that can attach to the exterior parts of the ship. So the main objectives of this is to identify the potential high-risk invasive species for this area. So risk assessment can be done at different scales, specific to species or specific to the vector, or it can be even done by testing with experiments to figure out, for example, if there are certain assumptions that are normally used in risk assessments, if they make sense or not. So I will be presenting results on how to apply the Canadian Marine Invasive Species tool and the development of an ecological risk assessment that is species specific, and then some experiments that we have done to see the survival and recovery of biofouling. But just to say that there are many different types of risk assessment, and one of those, it's also called the application of the Aquatic Species Invasiveness Screening Kit, ASISC, and it has been applied in many different types of environment at a global scale. So if you're interested in looking at this, we have published at a global scale screening using this tool, but I will not be presenting this. So first of all, before starting talking about risk assessments, let's just define what risk is. The risk is the combination of something happening, the probability of something happening, with the consequence of that. So what is the impact? So that is what it defines risk. So with this, there is a tool that was developed in 2016 by a group of scientists here in Canada that is called the Canadian Marine Invasive Screening Tool. And it is a rapid screening tool that can be applied quickly with available data. This means that we are interested, for example, in one species, and we want to assess what's the risk of that species in a certain ecosystem, in a certain region. And we will look at the information that is available in the literature, and we will try to answer 17 questions about the invasion process. And these questions will be scored from 1 meaning low and then 3 being high. So these 17 questions are related to the probability, what is the present status in the area, rate of introduction, the survival, establishment, and the spread. And then also it accounts for the consequence. Everything that is ecological impact is considered in here. All this adding up to 17 questions. So we had a list of pre-screened species that were 31 pre-screened species with different taxonomic groups that were zoobenthos, phytoplankton, and zooplankton. And then once we answered all 17 questions for each of these species, they were there. Then the scores, the mean of those scores, they were analyzed in a matrix that looks like this. This is the invasion, so it's the probability part, the likelihood of invasion, and the impact, so it's the consequence. And then all the mean values of those scores, they are put in this graphic, and then we can see that the upper right quadrant is the one that has the highest likelihood of invasion combined with the highest impact. So those can be considered what are the main species with the highest risk. And as you can see in the symbols, we see many of them that are zoobenthos. So with this original list of 31 species, we ended up identifying 14 species for the Hudson Bay complex as being high risk with, as I said, like combining all the 3 taxonomic groups, but they were the majority of them, they are zoobenthos. So the next step, it's like, okay, they are high risk, but what are they like really connected to our region? Because they can be really high risk, but then being in the other part of the world where there is no contact, so it's like it's really unlikely that it can arrive. So we performed this spatial analysis where we had a database of ballast water discharges and last port of call that were received in the Hudson Bay region during a 10-year period, going through from 2005 to 2014. And we had very detailed information, and we knew if there were single or multiple discharges and arrivals. So what you see, the black points is the ports and the regions where there were ships arriving to the Hudson Bay complex only one time in that database. But then the blue points are the ones that in the database showed multiple times that there were discharges or arrivals from these regions. And then for these 14 species that were analyzed previously and identified as high risk, it's like, where are they present? So I put all that information into a map and then combined and analyzed the cumulative presence of all these 14 species, which we call the high risk species richness. And we can clearly see that there are ecoregions with up to 11 high-risk species that are present in the regions where we have the ships coming from. So regions with more connections coincide with high-risk species richness. So this is just to evaluate not just high-risk species, but also the pathways. So Then at that point, we know that they can arrive, but then the next question that we asked is like, can they survive? And if they survive, is where will they survive? Will there be a predicted invasion hotspots that we can know where those potential invasive species can find suitable habitat in the same place, all together in the same place? So that's where we modeled and not only benthic species, but also phytoplankton and zooplankton, because before it was zoobenthos, phytobenthos, and zooplankton, and then we were also interested in adding a few phytoplankton species. So there was a total of 23 known invasive species that were used for this study. And before showing you the results, just very briefly and simply, and not going into any detail, I just want to explain how the prediction of suitable habitat is done and how this species distribution model works. They are correlative approaches that include as input data the coordinates of the species present, so where they are, and correlates that to the environmental variables known in that same point. And we can do projections and predictions into the future with climate change scenarios. Then all this data is used to model with different modeling techniques of choice, and there are many, many, many. And we will choose which one we want to use depending on the objective of the study. And the output is, in general, the probability distribution of the species in a projected area and time. And these continuous predictions can be transformed to binary outputs, which are suitable, not suitable. And then what I will be showing to you, the results are in this last format, so suitable, not suitable. As I said, we increased the number of species and taxonomic groups, and then we brought this analysis to a pan-Arctic scale in order to see if we could predict invasion hotspots. And using these techniques of predicting the habitat suitability, we identified there are 4 invasion hotspots at a pan-Arctic scale. One is the Hudson Bay, then the other is the Northern Grand Banks Labrador, Barents White Sea, and the Chukchi Eastern Bering Sea. So in here, the darker the color is where there are more species predicted to find suitable habitat in that same place. So for the species that were assessed, there were up to 20 species in one same pixel, if we can say that like that. And then we also measured the area, the potential area of habitat suitability. And then we predicted that into the future with an extreme climate change scenario. And we see that for the 2050 and at the end of the century, the same hotspots, invasion hotspots remain, but that they almost double the predicted area, predicted total area of suitable habitat for this species. And then from the 4 taxonomic groups that were analyzed, we saw that the one that is driving these invasion hotspots here is the one with the zoobenthos. It's because there are more species that are high risk, and because the predicted suitability area are in these regions. So there's another issue also that is related to domestic and Arctic ports, and knowing that the Canadian Arctic receives not only international vessels in their port, but also many domestic vessels. Just to define what is an international vessel are those that operate outside of the Canadian exclusive economic zone, and that they are required to perform mid-ocean exchange of their ballast water prior to entering Canadian water. So an international ship that comes, for example, from Europe will stop in the mid-ocean to make exchange of their ballast water, and then they will come to Canadian waters, in our case, the Hudson Bay region and Canadian Arctic, and then they can discharge if they need it, they can discharge in there. And then we have also a lot of ships that are domestic coming from arriving into the region of interest, and domestic vessels are those that operate entirely within Canadian waters. But although these vessels are not required to perform ballast water exchange, some they do, and if they do, they're typically in the coast that they do it. They perform a coastal ballast water exchange. So, for example, it comes from here, from fresh water. They will perform a ballast water exchange where the salinity is a little bit higher, and then they will come here. It has been shown that this practice may in some cases decrease the ballast water efficiency by increasing the abundance and diversity of species beyond that which was originally taken up in ballast in source ports. So a relative ecological risk assessment was done for future potential introductions of a few species in the Canadian Arctic, such as the periwinkle, Littorina littoria, and the soft-shell clam, Maya arenaria. And these species occur already in locations connected to Canadian Arctic ports through shipping and have the potential to be introduced via ballast water discharge. So all this was brief introduction of why we were interested in developing this ecological risk assessment that is species specific. So as I said, we were interested in some species that are already present. In here, we go back to the definition of risk. We have the likelihood of introduction and the consequence of occurrence. And then as we had a lot of detailed information, we wanted to know what to do with that and how to analyze it. So inside of the likelihood of introduction, the terms that were used to calculate this, it's arrival and then survival and establishment. For arrival, we had this information on the discharge volume of shippings arriving in Canadian Arctic ports. And this is the same database that was used in the previous study, where there are ballast water discharges and last port of call during a 10-year period, 2005 and 2014. With single and multiple discharges. And then this was combined with the transit time. So how much, the age of that ballast water, the longer the ballast water is inside of the ship, is like it has less risk of introducing new species because, well, it was a longer time without the light, for example. And then to address the survival and establishment, we use the habitat suitability as the habitat, the models that I showed previously, and then the time of the year. With this in mind, thinking that if the water is that is in the ballast water is released during the summertime, the risk will be higher than if it is during colder periods. And then all this was combined with the consequence of occurrence at impact. And then we added this habitat suitability part. And for the impact, we only looked at ecological impact, the biodiversity, habitat, interrelationships, and trophic interactions. And then for the habitat sensitivity, thinking that if a region is suitable for a certain species, it's not the same if that region is more sensitive than other regions. So in here, we considered if there were overlapping native species already in that region, or the biological importance of the area, or if there are hotspots of biodiversity, or if they are considered ecological and biological significant areas. So we put all this, and then we plot this into a matrix similar to the one that I presented before, but it is in a gradient It's a gradient matrix. So the relative likelihood of introduction was combined with the consequence of occurrence. It's this X, and then in a gradient matrix to illustrate the overall vessel-specific risk for each species. Port, here are the ports, I'm sorry, the names of the ports, and years for both domestic and international. And well, that's a lot of information, but just if you see there is like no clear pattern for all of the species or for all of the pathways. So what we want to show here is that the overall risk levels varied greatly among ports, years, species, and pathways, and in few cases, such as domestic vessels. Not domestic, such as Deception Bay, in domestic vessels, there was a trend for increasing risk through time. So we can see here in the upper right quadrant, where everything is red, domestic for Deception Bay, and the most recent years can be considered highest risk. So the important to highlight is that domestic voyages are a very important risk pathway, as maybe we didn't think or we don't think about that usually, thinking that the risk is much higher in international ones. Yes, and that can sometimes be greater than the international ones. So this is a very useful and interesting result that can be obtained from applying this protocol. But the only disadvantage is that it requires a lot of detailed information that is normally not available, and it's very, very difficult to obtain. Such as the quantity of ballast water discharge and the origin of water of each ballast tank. That's not easy to have. Well, the risk assessment are typically based the risk in pathway of the level of similarity in environmental conditions between the origin and recipient systems. So with this, we wanted to test in the lab the in-transit survival and post-arrival performance of half-fouling aquatic invasive species. And to understand this, as I said, like the environmental similarities, environmental conditions are the ones that drive sometimes the risk assessment, with the thought behind, like, for example, we have, there's a ship that comes from port A, well, that is fresh water, and then it arrives to port B, that is marine. So the species that could have been picked up here, and then when they get to marine, like the environmental similarity, it's decreases the risk, saying like, okay, it comes from fresh water, where marine, like the risk is low. But it's normally the ships come from another ports previous to this port that is called the last port of call. So it's very likely that there are marine environments that were the previous to the last port of call, and then another one, and then like that. So that is not at all measured or captured in risk assessment. So we wanted to test this by using two model species, one representing freshwater, that was the zebra mussel, and then the one representing marine waters is the blue mussel. So this was a very, very complex experiment, but just I will try to explain it very fast and quickly. And what we have done is just to capture these transitions from, for example, marine, then freshwater, and then marine, and then the same for freshwater, but the other way around. And then we tested this at different temperatures, and then we measured for survival. Can they survive these changes of temperature and salinities? And if they survive, it's like, can they recover after that? thinking that this can survive the fresh water, and then when it arrives to a marine, a very similar, it's like what's their health state. So for that, to measure the recoverability, we measure the feeding and filtration activity. So what we found is that there is an underestimation of risk associated with a transit when it involves a transition between freshwater and marine environments, and then that there is a better survival at colder temperatures. And blue mussels can survive up to 14 days in freshwater, and then zebra mussels can survive up to 8 days in marine water. So it is very important to consider the resistance of fouling organisms to adverse conditions in vector and species risk assessment. For sure, like mollusks, they can close their valves, and they are known to be very very resistant to conditions in the environment, to the changes in the conditions in the environment. So we only tested with this, but then it's like we hope that in future more general risk assessments, there is a way that this can be reflected. Instead of just thinking, okay, it comes from a different environmental condition, so the risk is really low. So in summary, domestic voyages are important risk pathways. We identified 14 high-risk species, benthic and planktonic. And then ecoregions with more connections coincide with high-risk invasive richness and underestimation of risk when transit between freshwater and marine environments. And then also that there's a habitat suitability for potential high-risk invasive species under present and future environmental scenarios. And that Hudson Bay, it's an important invasion hotspot mainly for zoobenthic species. So now I will talk to you a little bit about invasive species also, but more freshwater, and then more related to at a provincial scale. And we know that in more southern regions like Quebec, the challenge comes from more than one pathway and vector. So in here, there are other challenges, and not only domestic and international shipping, but also pleasure crafts, live bait, which, by the way, in Quebec, it's illegal since 2017. But we suspect that there's people that still use live bait, even if it's illegal, but we're trying to ameliorate that. And then there's also aquarium trade and aquaculture. And if we see this in a climate change context, in a province like Quebec, where most invasions up to date are more concentrated in the southern regions, the most likely change due to global warming and increasing temperature is that species will find more suitable conditions outside of these areas. So they will increase their range because they will find more suitable conditions. And this would also be a possibility even for native species that could also expand their range in regions where they are normally not distributed. So there are other challenges in this context. So in Quebec, there is an action plan against the invasive alien species that is based in 3 main axes, that is the prevention, surveillance, and control. But we must say that for the prevention part is the one that takes most of the time, and where we try to focus also, since I think everybody here knows that once the species has arrived and it has been introduced and found the conditions that are suitable, and they reproduce and establish, it's like very, very, very difficult to apply any control actions. So just to put this graphically, here we have, for example, on the risk perception. It's like, okay, so there are 2 rocks that will probably fall, and we're aware of that. We perceive that. Then there is the risk assessment. It's like we need to measure it and try, to use all these that I have presented before. What is the likelihood of that, and what is the impact of this? And then we need to communicate. This is the risk communication. It's like, hey, watch out, this is dangerous. So in here, it's I see this as the prevention state. And then the risk management is once it has been already introduced and is established, and then there's the surveillance and control is risk management. Okay, so run or do something. So what is the state of aquatic invasive species, more centered into animal aquatic invasive species and freshwater in Quebec? So we already have present in our waters the zebra mussel, quagga mussel, the banded Ministère snail, Chinese Ministère snail, wandering pond snail, and Asian clam. So these are just the mollusks. The other taxonomic groups will follow. Just to say that some of the species that I'm presenting, they are very well established, but some others have only been occasionally found. So they're not in the same at the same stage, invasion stage of establishment or introduction. So just as an example, the zebra mussel in Quebec, it has been present since the 1925 in the St. Lawrence River. So it was there, like contained, and then suddenly in 2017 it was found in a region that is called Estri. It started in one lake and then in another one and another one, and it's presently expanding its range in the region. So we're here like at the perception, assessment, communication, and trying to manage all at the same time. And we were like, everything happened very fast. And then just a few weeks ago, there were first mentions of the zebra mussel in the Lac Temiscouata, that is in the very east of Quebec, in a region that is called Bas Saint Laurent. So we were trying to deal with this expansion, and what is mainly about the assessing the risk to try to avoid the expansion to all of this region. It's like we're aware that the geological conditions of this region are very suitable for the zebra mussel. This is the Appalachian region, which is a region known to have sedimentary rocks and rich in limestone, and so it is very rich in calcium. And calcium is one of the main ingredients that the zebra mussel need to survive and reproduce. So we are aware already that all this region are already knowing this, that geologically the conditions can be given for them to survive and reproduce. So we are trying to put all these plans in action to avoid more spreading. Then following up, we have freshwater jellyfish that, as you can see, there are many points that are, it's very well distributed. And then we have crustaceans such as the fish hook, water flea, spiny water flea, bloody red mysid, scud, rusty crayfish, and a few mentions of Chinese midden crab. And then for fish, there we have several ones, and in different also states, as I said before, some occasionally found and some other established, such as the tench, round goby, tube-nose goby, which was just a few weeks ago, it was found for the first time in Quebec. So we're also trying to deal with that and seeing trying to analyze what's the risk and until where it can expand its range. The red pink salmon, we have a few occurrences also in the north, green sunfish, grass carp, and goldfish. So those are the ones that we have already in our waters, but we have a list of species on the watch. So it's we have a New Zealand mud snail and a few carps also, and a snakehead and a roof, and then we have several crayfish. And for this, and we have other species also in our list. And some of these are closer to our borders, like for example the ruff, it's already in the Great Lakes. So it depends really on what is the presence, where they are present, and what's the impact and all that. So we want to measure all that and apply CMIST to all of these species. And as I said, as in a higher number of species that are not presented here, but those are the plans for the following months. So with this, I just want to leave you and thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And I know maybe I was like so fast that there was a lot to cover. So hopefully it was clear. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Great presentation. So I will maybe start us off with a question. If you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A so I can read them, but I will maybe kick us off. I know you had, or you showed us what the predicted distribution looks like for the benthos. What does that look like for the other three taxonomic groups that you mentioned?
I think I have a backup slide for that. Yeah, here. So yeah, I only showed for the zoobenthos. In here was the invasion hotspots that were predicted, and as I showed you, there were these four that was driving. There was thanks to the zoobenthic species that they are predicted to have suitable habitat here. But then the same was done for the phytobenthos and zooplankton and phytoplankton. And then, as you can see, there were less species than zoobenthos. But at the same time, also you can see that the conditions were not the optimal for this type of organisms, except for phytoplankton, for example, that more on this region that coincide a little bit, but they were like less species that were considered high risk. So it can be driven by the higher amount of higher number of species being included in the analysis, but also it is known that a lot of invasive species are mainly benthic. So Great. It's like a combination of all that.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. So our first question in the Q&A here, where was round goby detected in Quebec?
Where was more?
Sorry, where was round goby detected?
The round goby. Yeah. I don't know if the one that I presented that it was recently discovered and detected is the tube nose goby. So I'm not sure if that's the question. So tube nose goby is the one that was recently, and it was just here close to the border with Ontario. That is Lac Saint Francois. I think in English it's Lake Saint Francis. But yeah, and it is the species. It has been seen that it is expanding its range downstream. And then for round goby, it is like in in the St. Lawrence, and then a little bit more in the Richelieu also, like that's where mainly it is found now.
Okay. Great. Thanks for that question. Next one. Have you completed detailed risk assessments and modeling for your freshwater aquatic invasive species similar to your marine species?
No, I haven't. That would be awesome. That can be much more challenging also.
Okay.
So, but yeah, it would be great in an ideal world where we can find, we have available data. I think that the best is to go and concentrate efforts with detailed species-specific risk assessment. But we're not in an ideal world, so
Yeah.
sometimes we need to generalize, and in that we lose like a lot of detail, but it's because sometimes data is not there.
Right. Okay. So there's data limitations then with freshwater, more so than with marine. Interesting. Looks like I have a question in the chat. Have canals been considered as a pathway of aquatic invasive species movement?
Yes, I haven't considered them and didn't include it in here, but yes, for sure. Like canals, like the main examples are the Suez canals, or then that it has really, like, they opened that and a lot of species were going and invading from all over. And so, but yes, they're important pathway.
Okay. Okay, I don't see any more questions. I'll maybe give another minute if someone wants to pop one in there. Jessica, if you'd like to just, stop sharing your screen, and then I will put mine up. If you do have a last minute question, please feel free to go ahead. We do still have some time. Okay, I don't think I see any. So I will just go ahead and thank you, Jessica, very much for presenting today, and thank all of you as well for tuning in. This webinar was recorded and it will be available soon on our website. That's, of course, invasivespeciescenter.ca. And just a reminder, after this webinar closes, to please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey. It'll just take you a minute and it would be much appreciated. Thank you, Jessica, as well, for being in the Halloween spirit.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoy Halloween.
Yeah, our next webinar in the series is I Spy Spotted Lanternfly, Michigan's response to the new species detection. That's going to take place at the same time as today, 11 in the morning on November 17th. My colleague Madison will be hosting that one, and Robert Miller from the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development will be presenting. So please join us then. And for now, have a happy Halloween. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.